Good afternoon readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and last week I read To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper, thanks to a little read-along hosted by TJ Reads the Stars. While I found that I couldn't really participate in much of the read-along discussion due to it being on Twitter and me being not on Twitter, I did find myself once again passionately in love with this book. To me, what defines a great work of literature is a book that I can read time and time again and always find something new, some different question to ask, and that is certainly true for To Kill a Mockingbird. I thought I had done this book to death when I studied it for GCSE, but this time round it was like seeing the view from a mountain on a clear day when you have only previously climbed it in the cloud. And I made lots of notes as I reread it. I made like over 10,000 words, because I'm cool like that. And I grouped those notes into about 20 different overlapping themes. There's a lot to this book. Small book, big ideas. I did consider making a video in which I would attempt to summarise each one of those themes, but let's face it, my videos are always too long already, and I didn't want to go off on too many tangents. So if you want to know more about the other themes that I think there are in To Kill a Mockingbird, talk to me in the comments and we will talk it all through. Instead of doing all of that, today I'm going to look at the themes that relate specifically to youth, childhood and upbringing, and I'm not even going to go into that much depth with that. Because this is a popular classic, I'm just not going to worry too much about spoilers, because sometimes it's nice to be able to discuss the development of a character across the whole book and talk about the ending as well as the beginning. So I'm going to start with the idea of coming of age. In the video in which I said that I was planning to reread To Kill a Mockingbird, I described it as an American coming-of-age novel that focuses on the narrator, Scout. Scout, at the beginning, is a 6-year-old tomboy. She plays in the street between boundaries that are fixed by fear. On the one hand, fear of so-called Boo Radley, the neighbourhood spectre, and on the other, fear of the cantankerous Mrs. Dubose. I realise I'm talking in quite a teachery tone. It's because I'm reading from a script, and I need to today. I couldn't do this video without this script, so I apologise if I sound too much like your English teacher. These borders are described thusly. The Radley place was inhabited by an unknown entity, the mere description of whom was enough to make us behave for days on end. Mrs. Dubose was plain hell. Evocative. By the end of the novel, Scout has been forced to understand and confront these two fears. She knows Arthur Radley, she knows about Mrs. Dubose, as well as some significantly more advanced, terrifying situations, such as the fear of seeing her father confronted by an angry mob, and the fear of being attacked in the dark by something other than a spectre. Moreover, she has become a young lady. She has learnt to swallow her pride and walk away from childish fights. She has watched real grown-up conflicts unfold and begun to analyse them in her own way. We see Scout make friends, go to school for the first few years, and begin to question adult views. For example, when she questions Aunt Alexandra's view that the thing is, you can scrub Walter Cunningham till he shines, you can put him in shoes and a new suit, but he'll never be like Jem. Which contrasts well with earlier on in the book, when Scout herself takes in adult opinions about different families unquestioningly, and even herself says of Walter, "He ain't company, Cal, he's just a Cunningham." At the end of the book, Scout stands on the Radley porch, far outside of her childhood boundaries, and she thinks on all of the occurrences of the last 2.5 years. She reflects, "As I made my way home, I thought Jem and I would get grown, but there wasn't much else left for us to learn, except possibly algebra." A sentiment expressed with her characteristic naive humour. Scout was my favourite character when I read this novel as a teenager, because I felt I could really relate to her character, her feeling of not having her needs met by the educational system, and her frank narration. Here's the thing though, To Kill a Mockingbird is not about Scout coming of age at all. The character who truly comes of age in this novel is Jem. In terms of growing up, Scout makes zero progress in this novel, aside from that little reflection in the last few pages, which is in itself just endearingly naive. I keep using the word naive for Scout because that is who she is. She is naive, and even the things that she learns can't stop that for her. So, as I was saying, Scout makes zero progress in this novel in comparison to Jem, something which I realised only when I reread it this time round. Although Scout is the narrator, Jem is the main character to me now. He is the person things actually happen to. Scout does nothing in this story. If Scout is the heroine, she is the typical lazy female heroine of literature. She lets the men in her story push her around, sometimes literally, with Jem pushing the tyre down the sidewalk with all the force in his body. She just gets pushed around a lot, like all the time. In the Maycomb pageant at the end, she plays a hock of ham, and she doesn't even do that well. When it comes to the active climax of the book, when the children are attacked by Bob Ewell, she is encased in a cage of chicken wire that makes it impossible for her to offer anything of use to the conflict, other than being pushed to the ground. Instead, she cries out for Jem's help and thinks, "I could not move." Pretty much summarising her in the book, she cannot move, she can only narrate. Scout is the antithesis of the omniscient narrator. She is the non-niscient narrator. That sounded better when I was typing it. And frequently when people talk to her about difficult topics, she simply does not get the nuances of the discussion. In quite comical ways, she provides the light relief in her responses to the issues that are raised. This isn't meant to be a massive anti-Scout rant, I promise. In fact, this disconnection that Scout has from the action of the book is vital for her narrative power. She is the eyes of human innocence, looking on human prejudice and malice. By her very lack of understanding, she helps the reader to interpret the book, which contributes to this idea of childhood as a golden innocent period that helps the adults in the story to reflect on their own actions. For example, later when Scout confronts the mob that Atticus is up against, she helps them to interpret the situation that they are in and decide to take a step back. In stark contrast to Scout's position, Jem is a truly well-developed character. It's beautiful to watch his relationship with his sister develop from pride in her. Scout yonder's been reading ever since she was born and she ain't even started school yet, to conflicting with her, hollering, "It's time you started being a girl and acting right," to becoming a supportive brother to her, for example, coming to her pageant and helping her to tolerate Aunt Alexandra. Jem emotionally connects to the conflicts in this story far more deeply than Scout. The trial leaves him with his face streaked with angry tears. And unexpectedly to all those around him, the normally placid Jem lashes out at several times in the book, both because of the direct stress of the trial and because of the background broiling of adolescence beginning, adolescence being painted as a particularly different time in this book. Most notably, this happens with Mrs. Dubose when he physically attacks the flower beds of an old and ill woman and then has to learn why his actions were so unacceptable and work to make amends. To me, Mrs. Dubose is Jem's own personal mockingbird. She sits on her porch doing nothing but sing, even if what she sings is vile abuse. And Jem attacks her when she is unable to defend herself. His realisation of this is a turning point for him as a character, and from then on we start to see him behaving in a more adult way. For example, informing Atticus when Dill runs away to Maycomb, something that the other children see as breaking the remaining code of our childhood. And also, in a more sensitive way, he goes from imagining Boo Radley as a turtle to be smoked out of his shell. He says, it's sort of like making a turtle come out, strike a match under him. And then when Dill protests, turtles can't feel stupid. To telling Scout not to squish a roly-poly, a type of insect, because they don't bother you. Jem's coming of age, due to the events at the core of this novel, is symbolised by the physical changes in him. For example, in the days after the trial, he discovers the first hair on his chest, that accepted symbol of becoming brave and becoming a man. More drastically, we hear from the very first paragraph of the story that the broken arm that Jem receives from Bob Ewell's attack permanently changes his body, leaving him with his left arm somewhat shorter than his right. When he stood or walked, the back of his hand was at right angles to his body, his thumb parallel to his thigh. But he's not self-conscious about this injury, because he is confident and self-possessed. He has reached a personal equilibrium. This injury to his arm links him directly to Tom Robinson, who is described as having his left arm fully 12 inches shorter than his right, hanging dead at his side. For Jem, coming of age means becoming sensitive to the world. And Tom Robinson is a sensitive character. He is sensitive to Mayella Ewell when the rest of Maycomb simply is not. But what are Scout and Jem coming of age into? Childhood, as I've said, is presented as this precious, golden and innocent period. Adulthood, with few exceptions, is a world of meeting social expectations, including the expectation of being a narrow-minded bigot. And where does it all go wrong? It goes wrong in adolescence. There are almost no adolescent characters in the book, but there are a couple of mentions from which we can infer that Scout and Jem have a rocky road ahead of them through which they will have to cling to the foundation laid in their childhood over this period. Exhibit A is Mayella Ewell. Now, I could make a whole video about Lee's handling of Mayella Ewell and the theme of the wrongful accusation. I think it's a very topical issue at present, and interesting to see it represented in one of America's best-loved stories. But the fact remains that within the world of To Kill a Mockingbird, Mayella Ewell is the 19-year-old who does wrong. Her loneliness and her struggles with her own prejudices and burgeoning womanhood lead her to cause the death of an innocent man who has been nothing but kindness to her. And she's not the only character for whom teenage years results in wrongdoings or actions unfitting with their normal moral self. Even Atticus, as a young man, is described as being able to shoot 14 out of 15 doves, something that is so alien to Atticus as an adult who will barely touch a gun. Another character whose actions as a youth overshadow his entire life is, of course, Arthur Radley. His crimes in joining Maycomb's one and only gang, mild as they are, bring down the wrath of his family and see him transformed into a ghost-like figure. Arthur eventually gets his redemption, but it's clear that both he and Mayella Ewell grew up in a world that did not quite know how to support its youth through this troublesome phase of their life. And that brings me on to another theme in relation to childhood, which is upbringing. Not just upbringing within the family, but upbringing by society as a whole. Maycomb feels like a very real place, and it's beautifully described in this book. If you get a chance to reread it, focus on the descriptions of places within the town, the description of the courthouse, the description of Mrs. Dubose's house, the description of the Ewell's front yard. They make it very, very concrete. And within those beautifully described locations, there are types of people delineated. I'm just going to keep saying this until it sounds right. I first read this book in secondary school, where I had a head teacher who was obsessed with the proverb, "It takes a village to raise a child." I think it's a trite expression, but I love how in To Kill a Mockingbird we see how Maycomb's inhabitants all play a part in shaping the characters of Jem and Scout in positive and negative ways. Influencing figures include the wonderful Miss Maudie Atkinson, Dr. Reynolds, even Eula May on the telephone knows them well and can be seen as being involved in their childhood to a certain extent. They don't grow up in isolation, they grow up in Maycomb. One part of that is looking at education and flaws in the education system. Chapters 2 and 3 document Scout's first day of school and really highlight this. Whoa. We feel Scout's outrage as she is told to stop reading because it will interfere with her education. And there is a clear critique of this highly prescriptive system which the children think is called the Dewey Decimal System. But there is also a critique of a society that allows the unkempt and illiterate Ewell children to turn up for only one day of school per year and lets bright young lads like Walter Cunningham languish in first grade year after year because their poverty and the need for child labour leads to them missing out on key parts of their education. Later on in the book, Calpurnia takes Scout and Jem to her own church, First Purchase, so called because it was built with the first money earned by the freed slaves of Maycomb. There they meet an entire congregation who, one way or another, have been largely excluded from education, leading to them being largely illiterate or self-taught. While this isn't examined in depth, it does emphasise even more that Maycomb is failing its young people. Part of that is due to strict notions on who is qualified to raise children. Ask Maycomb inhabitants who this is, and it looks to me like the answer we will get turned back is white women. And so we get Aunt Alexandra rocking up on Atticus's doorstep one night and stuffing Scout into her Sunday best for missionary meetings. We get the women of said missionary meetings saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, that someone ought to go out there and tell the preacher to encourage Helen Robinson, Tom's widow, to lead a Christian life for her children from here on out. No such gesture of support is offered to Mayella Ewell because she is a white woman. and therefore must be able to look after her younger siblings, even though it is painfully obvious to the reader that Mayella is isolated and struggling, while Helen Robinson is surrounded by that strong church community that I already mentioned, and already leading that Christian life that the Maycomb missionary ladies would force upon her. Helen Robinson is now a widow, and her children have become fatherless, which brings us on to another aspect of the theme of youth: missing parents and the role of parents generally. Let's take a quick roll call of some of the characters in this story who are missing a parent. All of the Ewells, to start with. They have no mother, and a father who doesn't exactly take an active interest in their upbringing. There's Scout and Jem themselves, of course. They lost their mother when Jem was the age that Scout is at the start of the novel. Then there's their young friend Dill. If I haven't mentioned Dill so far, it's not because I don't think he's important. Dill has no father, which leads to him being passed around among his relations. Even when his mother meets someone new, in many respects this is harder for him to interpret and leads to him running away. Dill's lack of a paternal figure is ridiculed by another young character in the book, Francis, Scout's cousin, yet he himself deals with absent and potentially unloving parental figures who lump him off on his grandparents every year at Christmas. He has his full quota of parents, but they don't truly love him, and because of this he is presented as being an exceptionally boring and spiteful child. Because of this, we truly appreciate Atticus as a father figure. There are just so many sweet scenes in this book where he shows his affection for his children, whether by encouraging their questioning natures, laying down clear rules and boundaries for them, or giving them caring words of advice. Atticus is the role model for this book. He is fairly close to perfection, and I believe that we are supposed to take his dictums on how children should be raised as facts. For example, he tells his brother Uncle Jack, who is himself childless, "Jack, when a child asks you something, answer him for goodness sake, but don't make a production of it. Children are children, but they can spot evasion quicker than adults, and evasion simply muddles them." There are, however, downsides to Atticus as a parent. At one point, he succumbs to Aunt Alexandra and tries to tell Scout that she, as a Finch, is in some way better than other Maycomb families, an attempt which fails abjectly because it is so out of character both for Atticus and for this book, which is all about questioning that assumption that some people are inherently better than others. There is also the issue that because Atticus tells the truth, when he doesn't tell them something, there is just a huge gulf of nothingness. There's no white lies. If he had simply told his children that he was just popping out to see Hecate for a cup of tea, they wouldn't have followed him into the centre of town and come face to face with the angry mob that it was attempting to lynch Tom Robinson. A moment of terror for Atticus as a parent. Atticus's relationship with his children changes throughout the book, and in return how the children see him changes. A key passage for this is chapter 10 overall, which starts with Scout seeing Atticus as feeble and old, and then lets her watch him shoulder the gun and shoot the mad dog, taking responsibility for a task that no one else seems to want, and ends with the children respecting him more, but knowing that their pride in him doesn't have to be boasted about. The mad dog scene is interesting for other reasons. It's a metaphor, repeated several times in the book, of one speck of disease and unpleasantness making its way into Maycomb with the potential to spread and cause irreparable damage. For another example, see Miss Maudie Atkinson holding forth on Nutgrass on page 47. That's far from everything that I could say on this theme, but I hope I've begun to help you to consider how To Kill a Mockingbird questions our approaches to bringing up children and how it demonstrates how children develop in response to emotional incidents in their lives. I know I haven't been into a huge amount of depth here. I hope it's been interesting though, and that it hasn't entirely been a repetition of things that you already knew about To Kill a Mockingbird. But if there's anything that I've said that it's given you further thoughts or made you think about other parts of the book as well, let me know in the comments, because I would always be fascinated to talk about To Kill a Mockingbird. Even if you see this video in 5 years' time, comment, because I'll want to go back into this world. And I think this book really merits and benefits from constructive discussion. Maybe, like me, you've had this book set for school. If so, feel free to make use of some of the ideas that I've shared. All I'm going to say is check the quotes before you use them, and of course, read the book. Maybe as well you don't like this book, or you don't think that it has a very good presentation of youth and upbringing, in which case talk to me about that as well. I always want to talk to you guys, and I feel like I don't talk to you enough yet. I was so glad I read this book again. It's beautiful clarity and cohesive writing, the beautiful descriptions that it has that I've mentioned of Maycomb and its inhabitants was just what I needed after having had just a couple of reads that I didn't think to be very well written. In the week before I read this, I read The Obelisk Gate by N.K. Jemisin and Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, neither of which truly moved me. And I was feeling a little bit out of sorts with reading it, in all honesty. To Kill a Mockingbird's light-hearted take on dark topics was also the perfect counterfoil to the other book that I read last week, Dark Paradise by Rosa Liksom, which is a collection of Finnish short stories. I mean, it's called Dark Paradise, it is a dark paradise indeed in Rosa Likson's world, that I read for Women in Translation Month. Reviews of these 3 books will hopefully be coming relatively soon, but maybe not imminently. September is turning out to be a very busy month for me. I've got a lot of night shifts coming up, and I'm shattered already from the last ones that I did, and a couple of trips planned. I'm going to Inverness and I'm going down to Oxford, one with friends and one with both. So I'm really looking forward to those, but I'm going to be busy. So things might go a little bit quiet on the video posting side of things. However, reading-wise, I'm not going to be letting up. I'm going to be participating at least in the comments section for Shake Tube. I'm over halfway through Titus Andronicus and Julius Caesar as well. And I'm doing a little online course on William Wordsworth's poetry to kind of push me into poetry a little bit more, which is an area of reading that I don't really do that much of. And, oopsie. Shit, a brick. Oops. Not only did that really hurt my arm, it's completely probably messed up the camera location, but I'm nearly done. So I'm going to read Go Set a Watchman now as well to see if Scout is still as passive as she was in To Kill a Mockingbird 20 years later. So I'm looking forward to reading that. So all I can say is thank you to Tom for making me read this again, because it's been amazing. And also thank you to you guys for watching. Thank you very much for your attendance in this little seminar that I've been hosting. I'm sorry if it was really boring and really, really teachery, but I just needed a scripted way to get my ideas on this book, some of my ideas, a very narrow selection of my ideas on this book out into a video format. Happy reading to you all, and I will speak to you soon. Bye!